Welcome to the Software Heresy video series. This series is based upon a talk that I did for the Seattle Software Craft Group in February of 2020. And it's based upon a bunch of ideas that I've had rattling around my head for a number of years. One of the things that I've noticed is that many of the advances that you find with respect to software come not from small incremental improvements, but they come from stepping back and re-examining some of the assumptions that you've been dealing with the whole time. And when you re-examine those, you may end up taking up positions that end up being a bit heretical. And that's where the title comes from. This initial video will be mostly about some introductory stuff about the nature of knowledge. It's kind of framing about concepts that I'll refer back to in the future videos. And the future videos will all be on much more specific topics. To get started, there's going to be a warning at each of these videos. And the warning is that heresy can be uncomfortable or even a bit insulting. Sometimes our deeply held convictions are just that, deeply held, and going against them can make us uncomfortable or pissed off. Try not to take it personally. My goal in at least some of these is to insult you. If you made it through all the series and you haven't been at least a little insulted, I probably haven't done what I planned on doing. Now, for those who have seen me do talks before, you know that you can't come to a talk of mine without spending some time talking about meta-level concerns. So instead of talking about specific practices, we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of knowledge. And we're going to do it by starting to look at a study. And initially, the study isn't going to look like it really relates to software, but bear with me. So this study was done at a university by a couple of researchers, and they wanted to study humor. So they went out on the internet and they found 30 jokes. And they tried to choose jokes that they thought were representative of different levels of humor or different levels of funniness. Some that were quite funny and some that weren't very funny at all. But they realized that they weren't experts in humor, so they needed a way to know how funny each of these jokes were. So they recruited a few professional comedians, and each of the comedians went through each of the jokes, and they rated the jokes. They put those all together, and then they ended up with a set of objective joke ratings. Okay, so now that we have that, since this is a university, we're going to find a bunch of undergrads, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to ask each of the undergrads to rate those same set of jokes. And then the next step, shouldn't surprise anybody, we're going to put those two together. And we're going to group our undergrads by how good they are at rating jokes. Or more specifically, how well their joke ratings correlate with the joke ratings of the professional comedians. And then we're going to group them into quartiles, so 4 groups. There'll be a bottom group that isn't very good at understanding humor and what's funny, and then there's a top group that is very good at understanding humor and what's funny. And at this point, okay, this doesn't really look very interesting. Why do we care about humor? What is this going to tell us? But the researchers did a very interesting thing after they did this part. They asked each of the undergrads how good they thought they were at rating jokes or about understanding humor. So they're doing a measure of perceived ability. So we know how good an undergrad really is at doing jokes, and we know what their perceived ability is, what they think they can do. And then now we have these two values, and we can plot them. And we end up with this figure from the study called perceived ability to recognize humor as a function of actual test performance. So the straight line that's kind of dotted. The reason that's a straight line is just inherently we group these undergrads into quartiles. So inherently we're going to have a bottom quartile that's very low and a top quartile that's pretty high in percentile ratings. The interesting part is the solid line, which is the perceived ability. And more specifically, this difference here. So we see the people that are in the bottom quartile, which means they're at 25% or lower in their ability to recognize humor. They thought that their ability was about 58%. So they think that they're in the third quartile. And notice next to them, we have the second quartile, who performs a lot better, but thinks they're at about 60%. So both of these groups significantly overestimate how good they are at this. Now, because this is a psychology study, you have to write things up in the language of psychology studies. So what they said was lack of metacognitive ability leading to illusionary superiority. Now let's pull that apart a little bit. So metacognitive ability is all about understanding your own ability to do a task. And because these people don't have that ability, they can't tell how good they are, they have really no idea how they compare to other people. So they just kind of say, well, I'm a little better than average. Now, another interesting part on this study is these people at the top. The people that are really good actually tend to underrate themselves a little bit. They're in the top quartile, but they only think that they're about at 70%. At this point, you should be saying, so what does this have to do with software? But the same researchers did another study, and this is the data from that. Perceived logical reasoning ability and test performance as a function of actual test performance. So this time, instead of looking at humor, we're looking at logical reasoning ability, which I will argue is very close to things that we need to do software. And this graph is actually even more striking than the other one. We see the people at the bottom quartile are well above 60 and almost to 70% in how good they think they are. And the people in the second quartile are almost the same. It's not until we get to the third quartile where people actually have a pretty reasonable estimation of how good they are. So to put this another way, fully half of the group doesn't have a rational estimation or a good estimation of how good they are at logical reasoning. They grossly inflate their ability to do this. Now, some of you may recognize this. This is a little study produced by two researchers. The two main researchers were Kruger and Dunning, and it ended up being known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Okay, so what? Well, I've talked with this about a fair number of people, and the response I get is almost always the same. They just look at the graph and they say, I work with people like that, and they're the worst. And the really kind of funny thing about that is they're exhibiting Dunning-Kruger about Dunning-Kruger. They think they understand what Dunning-Kruger means, but they actually don't know the area well enough to be able to rate how well they understand it. The point about Dunning-Kruger is that it is about a specific ability to do specific things. So you could be very highly competent in one area and very incompetent, or in the lower quartile, in another area, and still not realize it. This is more not about people, it's about just the nature of how our minds work. Until we reach a given level of competence, we don't have the ability to tell how competent we are. So to get to the end of this section, I want to ask you a question. And the question is, how does the bottom quadrant feel compared to the top one? And by that I mean, think of a case where you are quite competent at something, and you know you're competent at something. because you knew in the past that you used to be incompetent about it. Now you're competent. And think of another case where you were incompetent about something but didn't know it. And how does that feel between those two? And the whole point of Dunning-Kruger is they actually don't feel any different. There's a really interesting talk by Catherine Schultz, who talks about this same thing. She talks about it in the concept of being wrong or being right. And what she says is it does feel like something to be wrong. It feels like being right. The point being, we can't tell the difference. That's all I want to talk about for this specific video. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you'll show up for the next video when we'll get into more specific programming related things.